Hello, Bellevue family, and welcome to this week's virtual class where we'll continue our study of Ecclesiastes. This week we are in Ecclesiastes chapter 10. Hopefully in the email that came out earlier today that led you to the video, you were able to get a copy of the handout. The handout, as always, has a list of questions that we're going to work our way through in chapter 10. Chapter 10 is kind of back to the more Proverbs type style of writing in Ecclesiastes. So we're going to take these Proverbs, kind of a chunk at a time and talk about the questions that relate to those as we go through them. So let's start out with looking at Ecclesiastes chapter 10 and verse 1. Solomon the Koheleth says this: "Dead flies make the perfumer's ointment give off a stench. So a little folly outweighs wisdom and honor." And the questions that I have related to this verse says, what illustration is used to show how folly ruins the reputation of the wise and honorable, and how does this apply to our day-to-day conduct? And when he's talking about the perfumer's ointment, he's most likely talking about an ointment that would have been made up of a mixing or a blending of many different spices, to where the introduction of something as foul as a dead fly would essentially destroy the ointment. And so that's the illustration that he's using, but the meaning here is quite simple, that it doesn't take much. It doesn't take much foolishness to destroy what could otherwise be a good and wise life. It doesn't take much foolishness to destroy that. And that's a lesson that is taught throughout Scripture. I've got in the notes, I've got reference to a couple of places that where this is, the same kind of idea is addressed. In 1 Corinthians 5, Paul is talking to the Corinthians about how they've got someone in their midst that's committing a sin, and that the people are, in essence, they're outwardly approving what this sinner is doing. And in the midst of this discussion about the effect that this sinner is having on the congregation, he says, "Your boasting is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump?" And the thought here is the same. Just like a dead fly in a very complicated ointment will destroy the ointment and make it smell bad, a little leaven will leaven an entire lump of dough. It's also similar to what Jesus had to say in the Sermon on the Mount when he talks about the influence that we have. And he says, "You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet." And so again, the idea that we have to be careful that we don't let, a little foolishness destroy our lives, destroy our reputation, destroy our influence. That it doesn't take much. It doesn't take much to destroy whatever wisdom that we might have. Let's go to verses 2 and 3. Still talking about kind of a contrast between wisdom and folly. He says in verses 2 and 3, "A wise man's heart inclines him to the right, but a fool's heart to the left. Even when the fool walks on the road, he lacks sense, and he says to everyone that he is a fool." And the questions that I have are, what is the significance of the right versus the left? And when does the fool display his folly to everyone? I think the right and the left here are a play on the idea that the right hand, if you will, is a symbol of strength, a symbol of strength, because the majority of people are right-handed, not everyone, but the majority of people are right-handed. So tend to think of the right as being stronger, being in more control, and the left being weaker and having less control over that. So he's using this as kind of a metaphor of saying that, the one that's wise is the one who is stronger, the one who's in more control. The one who is foolish is the one who is weaker, who has less control of their lives. And then the part, the question about when does the fool display his folly to everyone? And the answer is really all the time. The example he gives is even when the fool walks on the road, meaning even just trying to walk down the street, the fool is going to exhibit to those he comes in contact with that he's a fool. He can't help but do that because that is his nature. And we'll talk more about that as we go along through this this chapter about ways in which you recognize the fool, one of those being one who's always talking, thinking that they have things figured out. All right, let's go down to verse 4. He says this, "If the anger of the ruler rises against you, do not leave your place, for calmness will lay great offense to rest." And the question that I have there is simply, how should one respond when the anger of the ruler rises against them? And I think the point here is that sometimes, the ones that we encounter, the ones that we come in contact with, that we have conflict with, sometimes those can be individuals who are in charge, whether they're, rulers in a governmental level or rulers in a work setting or whatever they might be. There could be times when we are in conflict with that we can be in conflict with those who are in charge, with those who are rulers. But the advice here is to not respond to that in anger. Don't let yourself be drawn into that conflict. Don't let yourself be drawn into retaliation, but instead, respond with calmness, respond with patience. We'll talk more about this later, but Paul instructed in Philippians 4 to let your forbearance, your gentleness be known to all. And I think that's the emphasis here is that, if we have a conflict with someone who is in a position of authority, we need to let our gentleness be seen. We need to let our patience be seen, our forbearance, our calmness. And he says calmness will lay great offenses to rest. Let's go down to verses 5 through 7. He says, "There is an evil that I have seen under the sun, as it were an error proceeding from the ruler." He's continuing to talk about a ruler, those in charge. "Folly is set in many high places, and the rich sit in a low place. I have seen slaves on horses and princes walking on the ground like slaves." And the question that I have there is, what injustices did the Qoheleth see coming from those in power? And the Qoheleth throughout this book has talked about how, I see foolishness where I should expect to see wisdom. I see unrighteousness where I expect to see righteousness. And I see bad things happening to good people and good things happening to bad people. And he's always talking about how all these things don't seem to add up. And this is another one of those situations where he's saying that, it's the fools that are in the high places and the rich are in the low places. The slaves are the ones on horses and the princes are the ones walking on the ground. And, just because someone is in a position of authority doesn't mean that they're the most qualified, doesn't mean that they're the strongest, they're the best, they're the wisest, they're the smartest. It could be that those who are foolish rise to positions of power. And I think this is just another example of something that we've talked about. We talked about it a lot last week in chapter 9, and we've talked about it a lot through this whole book, is that, under the sun, I want you to go back and look, verse 5, he specifically is talking about this being under the sun. That means life unto itself, life kind of lived from end to end. And under the sun, life doesn't add up. Life doesn't fit into an equation. Go back to chapter 9 where he said the race is, the race is not to the swift, the battle to the strong, the bread to the wise, or riches to the intelligent. Things don't always work out the way we think that they should or the way that they're going to work out. And this is another, illustration of, it seems like all the puzzle pieces are in the wrong place. You've got individuals, again, who are exhibiting foolishness, who have risen to positions of power. You have those that are slaves that are in, again, positions of power, and those that seem like they should have power that are treated poorly. And it just, things do not add up. And this is, again, just another way of saying that under the sun, life doesn't always make sense. Matter of fact, most of the time, I believe life doesn't make sense. The things that we go through, the things that we deal with, the things that happen unexpectedly, that there's, time and chance that happen to everything, as Solomon said back in chapter 9. We are facing constantly unfair and unexpected things that happen in life. And that same sentiment here is going to continue in the next few verses. So let's go down to verses 8 through 11. He says, "He who digs a pit will fall into it. and a serpent will bite him who breaks through a wall. He who quarries stones is hurt by them, or quarries stones is hurt by them, and he who splits logs is endangered by them. If the iron is blunt and one does not sharpen the edge, he must use more strength. But wisdom helps one to succeed. If the serpent bites before it is charmed, there is no advantage to the charmer. And the question that I have for this is, what do the 6 illustrations, and there are kind of 6 things that we went through there, what do the 6 illustrations in these verses say about the nature of life and how we should approach it? And some might even say, well, verses 8 and 9 don't have anything to do with verses 10 and 11. But I think they do. I think they're all related. And I think part of this is still that same theme that we saw in the previous verses. And that is that, life doesn't always work out the way we expect. There's this element of time and chance, this element of the unexpected and the unfair. And some of the examples he gives there are, you dig a pit. And he says, you dig a pit presumably for some type of purpose, but then you end up falling in the pit that you dug, so you hurt yourself. Then you have a situation where you need to tear down a wall or break through an old wall. And what happens? You get bit by a snake who's on the other side of the wall. Or he says, you need to quarry some stones, and you're hurt by that action of quarrying stones, of gathering stones. Or you split logs and you're endangered by them. So again, these are all things that you don't expect to happen. You don't expect that you're going to fall into a hole that you dug. You don't expect that when you tear down a wall that there's going to be a snake behind it. Because again, unexpected things can and will happen because life doesn't fit into an equation. So, we spent a lot of time last week in chapter 9 talking about how we deal with the unfair and the unexpected. But here's another angle on that in these last couple of verses here, verses 10 and 11, is, thinking about, well, what do we do knowing that the unexpected can happen? Well, he says, if the iron is blunt. So if you think about, if it's an axe, it's a axe made out of iron and it's blunt, I'm going to have to work a lot harder in order to chop down a tree. Or if my sword is blunt, it's going to take me it's going to be a whole lot harder to cut. So what should I do instead? I should sharpen it. I should prepare. He talks about the serpent biting before it's charmed. That there wasn't enough care taken to make sure that the serpent was charmed before there was interaction with the serpent, just using these as examples. And so I think the overall message is that, we can't let time and chance keep us from doing the things that we need to do, from being active, from working, from engaging in life. We cannot let time and chance keep us from doing those things. However, we need to proceed with caution, and we need to be as prepared as we can be, because we know that the unexpected can and will happen. So do what we can to be prepared. This is just, kind of good common sense. And part of being prepared is, if you need to sharpen your blade, sharpen your blade. If you need to charm the snake, which I can't imagine a situation today where you need to charm a snake, but if you need to, then charm the snake before you get bit. And so I think, again, the message here, I believe, is, you can't let time and chance keep you from living your life, but you need to do so cautiously, and you need to do so being as prepared as you can, taking a view of the risk and understanding how to try and navigate those risks. All right, let's go down to verses 12 through 15. This is back to kind of thinking about wise and foolish again. He says in verses 12 through 15, the words of a wise man's mouth win him favor, but the lips of a fool consume him. The beginning of the words of his mouth is foolishness, and the end of his talk is evil madness. A fool multiplies words, though no man knows what is to be, and who can tell him what will be after him? The toil of a fool wearies him, for he does not know the way to the city. And so again, this is kind of a continuing contrast between wisdom and folly. And the question that I have, 2 questions I have here, are how does the Qoheleth characterize the words from a wise man, and then the words and actions of a foolish man? And he says the words of a wise man's mouth win him favor. What he says, you think about something, the words coming from a wise man, they're measured, they're calculated, they're thoughtful. And he says because of that, they win him favor. But the lips of the fool, they consume him. Why? Because he's just talking all the time. And the Qoheleth makes the point that no one knows what is to be. No one knows what's coming after. But the fool doesn't let that lack of knowledge stop them from talking as though they understand everything, talking as though they have everything figured out. The fool always wants to speak first because the fool thinks that they have everything figured out. It reminds me very much of something earlier in Ecclesiastes back in chapter 5 when the Qoheleth was talking about the seriousness of approaching God. And he says to draw near to listen is better than to offer the sacrifice of fools, for they do not know they are doing evil. He says, be not rash with your mouth, nor let your heart be hasty to utter a word before God. For God is in heaven, and you are on earth. Therefore, let your words be few. Because the fool, again, even before God, they think they have everything figured out. So they are always wanting to speak as though they have understanding. And so the contrast here, again, the wise speaks to the benefit of all to win, and it wins him favor. The fool consumes himself because even though he doesn't know what's coming, he speaks as though he does. Let's go down to verses 16 through 19. He says, woe to you, O land, when your king is a child and your princes feast in the morning. Happy are you, O land, when your king is the son of nobility and your princes feast at the proper time, for strength and not for drunkenness. Through sloth the roof sinks in, and through indolence the house leaks. Bread is made for laughter, and wine gladdens life, and money answers everything. And the question here is, how does the Qoheleth contrast the woeful land with the blessed land? What are the differences? And this is a scene of those in power, but it's still a contrast between wisdom and foolishness, wisdom and folly. And the overall point here is that the fate of a nation, the fate of a land, depends upon the quality of its rulers. And the contrast here is that you have the land that is woeful, that he says, woe to you, is one who has, a child as a king, and the princes feast all the time for pleasure. That they feast at improper times when they should be working, when they should be fighting. And the ones that are wise, they know the right times for different things. That when they feast, it's to build their strength, not for drunkenness. And then doubling down on the foolish, he says, through sloth, the roof sinks in. Through the laziness of the foolish leader, the roof is going to sink in. Through indolence, the house leaks, because again, the laziness and the lack of work on the side of the foolish leader. And still talking about bread is made for laughter, wine gladdens life, and money answers everything. That's the thinking, I believe, behind the foolish leader, is that, bread is just made for laughter, wine made for gladness, and money answers everything. Again, the thoughts of a fool contrasting the wise and the fool. Let's go down to verse 20, the final verse in this chapter. He says, even in your thoughts, do not curse the king, nor in your bedroom curse the rich. For a bird of the air will carry your voice, or some winged creature tell the matter. And the question is, why should one not curse the king, nor the rich? Some of this is about, having respect for those who are in authority, respect for those who are in power. And even God has commanded us to be, to serve those who are in authority, to be submissive to those who are in authority. So some of this comes from that respect that is due to those who are in authority. But some of this is also that, God can see us at all times. And when we're, saying something about those who are in power, we need to say it as though we're assuming they're going to hear it. They're going to hear the things that we're saying. Believe that, whatever you say is ultimately going to be heard by those you're talking about. And if you do that, I think you're going to be much more careful about the things that you say about others. If you believe that, well, they're ultimately going to hear what we're saying, then you're going to be much more careful about what you say about them behind their back. And again, back to what Paul said in Philippians 4, let your reasonableness, your gentleness, your forbearance be known to all. Don't be quick to speak a word of anger, to speak a word of criticism about others, but instead regard others with patience, with calmness, with gentleness, and with forbearance. And it will be that is the way that the wise will approach their relationships with all. And so again, this is a chapter that is, again, filled with Proverbs. Most of the Proverbs have to do with either the contrast between wisdom and folly, or this kind of overall idea that life under the sun, life lived into itself, does not fit into an equation, which can be the source of so much frustration for those who put their faith in this world. And the message to us should be that we need to put our faith somewhere else, somewhere that's not subject to the twists and turns, to the rolling changes in this life, but instead put our faith somewhere where nothing changes. Put our faith in heaven above the sun, and that will allow us to endure through the difficulties and the unexpected things that happen in life. Thanks for joining us this week. Thanks for hanging with us. I hope you're having a wonderful holiday season, and I hope that you will join us next week. Thank you all very much.